All right, this is the next quiz, Multicultural Studies 3.4. This is on immigration and identity. So as early as, thank you.
Mommy, oh, Mommy, my love.
All right, okay, now that she's at her phone and is entertained. Okay, so at the very beginning of our country, people realized that, there we go, more straight there. People realized that the people who made up the members of our new country in the United States of America, their ancestry was already pretty mixed. I mean, when this is the reason why they call this country the nation of immigrants, is because even from the very beginning of what is officially known as the United States of America, everybody's immigrants, and there's a lot of mixed people. It's not just whites and blacks. Even at the very beginning, there were 3 classifications of gender at the very, very beginning. There was whites, blacks, and Indians. Okay, so those are the only classifications that people ever really had. And then after a while, Mexicans started getting into the mix a little bit more, where you'd have people from other nationalities get into the mix a little bit more, and people realized we need more classifications, because what if someone is not white, is not black, is not Indian? What are they? But they noticed early on that there was a lot of mixture of blood in our country. If you were to ask somebody, when did your family come here to this land? There's going to be so many different answers within our country. There's going to be answers that are very soon, answers that we'll talk about hundreds of years ago, answers that we'll talk about thousands of years ago, or a couple thousand years ago. And they'll have people who came free, you have people who came in bondage, you have people who came desperate, you have people who came because they were looking for adventure. I mean, there's so many different stories, and that's just one thing that I think our country should take pride in, because we have such a mixture of people, and it is really hard. It is really, really hard to make everybody happy, or a majority of the people happy, when the people in the country are so vastly different. It just makes it a harder job for us, but if we can manage it, then we'll be better off for it. Let's see. So some people, when they came here, they were not given citizenship immediately. One of our very first laws about citizenship was in 1790. So just, this was a decade basically after they wrote the Declaration of Independence, or not the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. They had actually just barely ratified it recently, right before this. So this naturalization law of 1790, basically it said that the only people who could be citizens are free white people. Not even just white people, but free white people. So people who came to the Americas in bondage or as indentured servants, they didn't have citizenship either. So it was mostly a race thing, but it was also it was just basically a status thing. So one thing that changed who was allowed to be white in our country is manifest destiny. I know that we've talked about that in our class a couple times. So here is a picture of the Mexican War. This was part of manifest destiny, where as the whites in the Americas, they pushed more westward. They wanted that land all the way to the coast, and the only way they were going to get that is if they went to war with Mexico about it. Because if you remember, the Mexicans were the ones who owned officially the land that we live in today. So Utah on over, Arizona and New Mexico on over to the West Coast. And I'm hoping this is showing people who did stay and stayed as Americans, did not go back to Mexico. The treaty at the end of this war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, said that if you stay Okay, so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that if you stay, you will be allowed to be a citizen. You're allowed to be white, considered white in our country, so you can be a citizen. Because as we know earlier, the rule said, their law said that you had to be white in order to be a citizen. So basically, this made Mexican Americans to be considered whites. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is, even though they technically were considered citizens and technically were considered whites, the whites, the real whites, did not treat them as such. They definitely treated them as lesser people. So that is, there's one thing I want to show you guys. I thought this was really interesting. This was part of the Apex lesson. So you have 1848. This is right after the Mexican-American War. So they're classified as white. Then in 1930, suddenly the census is like, you're non-white. And this is because this is right after World War I, where basically right after we fought World War I, we suddenly started thinking, oh, we need to get back to our country and focusing on us and forget about everybody else. And we don't like immigrants. And there was a lot of immigrant racism going on. So anybody who wasn't actually white was definitely considered not white anymore. So this included Mexicans. Now, by this time, they would be considered citizens whether they were white or not. However, they are now considered non-white. In the 1940s, they're considered white again because they really need their labor. They really need people to come in and grow things and make our produce, because that has been stereotypical jobs that Mexicans came in to do. And this is, and I'm not saying that like that's my perspective. I'm saying this because at this time frame, this was when we were about to go into World War II, and people were still very racist. And basically, a lot of people thought that Mexicans were only good for working in the farm fields and picking and growing the crops. Those are jobs that still are dominated by Mexicans today. That is a fact. But because we needed them so bad, we're like, oh, let's make you white again. And in the 1970s, this is where most races have their official status of where they're at today. This started in the 1970s. So 1970s, they're counted as Hispanics. They're not white, they're not non-white, they are Hispanics. Okay. So I thought this was really interesting, so I wanted to show you guys that. So when people started immigrating to our country, it was really hard for them to make a decision on whether to assimilate or not. Now, if you remember from another video, assimilate means you basically adopt the majority culture. So you try to become like them. You dress like them, you act like them, you eat like them, you talk like them, you adopt everything in their culture, and you kind of forget your own culture. So when immigrants came to our country, a lot of them did choose to assimilate. If you chose to assimilate, you were never really considered fully white, but it was considered to be a step above those who did not choose to assimilate. Those who did not choose, they kept their culture, but they also just always stayed a minority, always were in the minority picture. They never got a chance really to get out of the minority if they kept their own culture, unfortunately, historically speaking. We have the next topic is the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first and only act or law that said nobody from this place could immigrate to our country. So basically they banned Chinese from coming to our country for 10 years. That's what the law did. After 10 years, they kept renewing that, so that would continue. It's not going on today, but there is a quota. Comfortable? A lot of different countries have quotas for how many people from their country can come into it. And we're not the only country that has that. A lot of other countries do have that, especially if they're getting a lot of, or they have to watch how many people are coming into their country. There's just only so many resources, right? But we've had quotas ever since then for different groups of people. So soon, right after the Chinese Exclusion Act, other laws followed to limit other nationalities as well. And when people are coming to our country, one of the biggest reasons why they're coming to our country is because they want to achieve something that's called the American Dream. So the American Dream, if you haven't heard of it before, is basically this idea that when you come to America, you can have a job, you can make enough money to have your own, to have a family, a house, white picket fence. You go get the mail in the mornings or when you get home from work, and you say hello to your neighbor, and you wave at ask the neighbor boy how they're doing. They're just like the typical suburban American dream idea of the American dream, right? So you got the house, you've got your family, you've got a few kids, you've got a white picket fence, you say hello to your neighbors, you ask how their mother-in-law is because you've talked to them a couple times. The typical suburban lifestyle is the American dream, but mostly the fact that you can come to this country, you can get a job, you can support your family, you can get an education, you can get the things that you would have had to work harder for or would have never gotten at other places. So that's what the American dream was. And unfortunately, though, in order to achieve this American dream, you have to have economic and political equality. You have to have your economic and political rights. So you have to be treated the same when it comes to voting. You have to be treated the same when it comes to wages. You have to be treated the same when it comes to if you're going to be offered the job or not. So that American dream is possible if things are fair and you have your rights. And that wasn't always the case in our country. And lastly, we've got this last topic that we'll talk about is this concept of a melting pot. So from the very beginning, our country is just mostly considered like a melting pot. That's not the best. That's not the best way to describe it today, but they used to describe it as this. So it used to be described as a place where all these people from all these different places come in, as you can see in this bowl, and they are mixed around. And when you boil something, you put, like when I make my favorite no bake cookies, I'll put the sugar and the cocoa powder and the milk and the butter, and I'll put it all together and I'll melt it together until it's one thing. I can't tell the difference between where the sugar and the milk is. I can't tell the difference, right? That's what a melting pot is it all becomes the same. Now, that's not really accurate as to what's happening. We're more of like a salad bowl where we all become together, but we all have our unique different features. Like you can tell the difference between a tomato and a lettuce in a salad bowl, right? But it all comes together to make a great salad. So this melting pot was the idea that this is what they wanted us to achieve, where everybody became one. We all assimilated into one American culture. So that's the idea of the melting pot. Last thing, at the end of the study unit, there are vocab cards. I kind of wish they were at the beginning of the quiz, but they're not. So I would recommend for you guys to look at the vocab cards at the end of the unit. And that was it for today. So thanks for watching, guys.